Hello and welcome to the Reproductive Justice Research Network YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Ari Sanchez, and I'm a research fellow at Gonville and Keys and an affiliate lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Cambridge. During the seminar, we had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Cordelia Freeman from the University of Exeter, Dr. Sydney Calkin from Queen Mary, University of London, and Dr. Francesca Moore from the University of Cambridge on reproductive justice and geographies of abortion. This talk is based on a recent article titled The Geography of Abortion, Discourse, Spatiality and Mobility, published in Progress in Human Geography, posted in the description below. And if you haven't done so already, please do follow us on social media at Reproductive Justice Kim. And if you like content like this, please do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. You're very welcome to this second event of the Reproductive Justice Research Network of this term. The Reproductive Justice Research Network is supported by the Reproduction SRI and ReproSoc in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Cambridge. It was launched in October 2021 with the aim of creating a collaborative, interdisciplinary and transnational platform for the discussion of the quest for reproductive justice in different regions and contexts. So far this year, we have enthusiastically facilitated a range of fantastic speakers and presentations on various topics in this area, including reproductive justice and disability, imperialism and global population policies, as well as displacement, maternity and reproductive justice for migrants and asylum-seeking people. Just to let you know that our final two events in Lent term will include a roundtable discussion with reproductive justice activists on the topic of reproductive labour and emotion work in activism, and we've had one confirmed speaker so far from the Sisters Uncut group who will be joining us for that event. Also next week, we're going to be joined by Professor Dana Ann Davis from City University of New York, and that event will be next Thursday, the 3rd of March. Confirmed speakers for Easter term include Dr. Carolyn Suffren and Dr. Rachel Roth, as well as activists from Red Acción Carcelaria in Chile, who will be joining us to discuss reproductive justice and incarceration. In May, we will have Dr. Ruth Pierce join us to discuss her work on the Trans Pregnancy Project. And in May and June, we will welcome Professor Laura Briggs from University of Massachusetts Amherst and Professor Dorothy Roberts from the University of Pennsylvania. So a lot of really exciting upcoming events this term and next term. So please, for more information and to keep up to date with the Reproductive Justice Research Network, please follow us on Twitter at ReproJusticeCam and on our Facebook page, the links which will be put in your chat now. My name is Aideen. I'm one of the conveners of the network alongside Dr. R. Sanchez Rivera, Dr. Julieta Chaparro, Dr. Katie Dow, and Dr. Sofia Ugarte. And we're very excited today to welcome Dr. Francesca Moore, Dr. Cordelia Freeman, and Dr. Sydney Calkin. So before I hand over to our fantastic speakers today, just a little bit about the presenters. So Francesca Moore is Associate Professor of Geography at Homerton College in Cambridge. Her research specialty is feminist historical geography. She focuses on gender politics from the 19th century to the present day, including cultures of harassment and the Me Too movement. Her work takes a historical approach, looking at the ways in which ideas and social norms from the past, such as the good mother, can be found in different forms in the present. And she's written extensively on women's protest cultures, illegal abortion, and the theoretics of power. And she's currently writing her first book. Dr. Cordelia Freeman is a senior lecturer in geography at the University of Exeter. Her research explores the geographies of reproductive justice in Latin America, particularly how abortions are accessed, Her current Wellcome Trust and ESRC-funded research project is examining abortion mobilities in Mexico and Peru with a focus on the abortion medication misoprostol. And Dr. Sydney Calkin is a senior lecturer in geography at Queen Mary University of London. She's the editor of After Repeal, Rethinking Abortion Politics 2020, and the author of Abortion Beyond Borders, Abortion Pills and the Future of Reproductive Freedom, forthcoming with the University of California Press in 2023. So before I hand over to our speakers, just to let you know, please feel free to make any comments or questions in the chat as the presentation proceeds. We will, however, have a Q&A session towards the end of the event today, during which you'll be able to pose your questions directly to our speakers. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And without further ado, I will pass over to Dr. Freeman. The title of their presentation today is Geographies of Abortion, Discourse, Spaciality, Mobilities.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. It's amazing to see so many people here. And we're so grateful for you inviting us to come and speak about the geographies of abortion today. It's great to be here. And so what we're going to be speaking about today is based on a paper that we've got. Oh, yeah, thanks, Fran.
Right. I've got fat fingers.
A paper that we are currently writing together, the three of us, thinking about the geographies of abortion. And I wanted to begin by thinking about why we need to take abortion seriously within reproductive justice, particularly as, thanks to you, the Reproductive Justice Network is why we're here. And I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the concept of reproductive justice if you're here on the call. But basically the framework that have come out from activism and scholarship from particularly Black women of colour in the United States using the tenets of the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to parent with dignity. And this was important in order to address the reproductive rights framework, which the issues have been that the law allows abortion access for some, particularly white, wealthy women in the global north, but this does not mean reproductive access for all. So reproductive justice has been really important in pushing thinking about abortion beyond just that choice framework, that option of having a choice to have an abortion is enough, and instead moving it more broadly to think about how issues like abortion, yes, are important, but they cannot be seen in isolation from other things such as contraception and sterilisation and clean water and thinking about care and the foster system and all of these other issues in terms of how people can control their own reproductive lives. So that's why we're thinking about abortion in terms of reproductive justice and seeing it as one of these issues that, yes, is about that second tenet of the right not to have children, but is also really important to thinking about the reproductive access more broadly in people's lives.
Okay, so we've been looking at a lot of reproductive literature in our collaborative work together, and so we sort of wanted to talk you through some of the references that we've been reading and thinking about, things that have been good to think with. There's been some work on uterine and placental geographies, work on pregnancy, work on childbirth and child rearing, and also on pregnancy loss. But what we've noticed is that there's a bit of a gap, really, a bit of a gap where we would like to start to think academically about abortion. So it's been really interesting for us to review that literature and find that gap.
So I'm not sure that I need to make the case for anyone on the call here that it's important to think about abortion. Clearly, you're all interested in thinking about abortion, but from our disciplinary perspective in geography, we've identified a kind of gap, and more than a gap, we've identified a kind of reluctance to engage with abortion in the discipline. And so we want to make the case in this paper we're writing and to you today, we want to make the case for why it's important for geographers to think about abortion. I mean, the first thing, abortion is a highly common life experience, right? I mean, in the US and UK, for instance, somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 people will have an abortion in their lifetime. Secondly, this absence is contributing to the stigmatization of abortion, right? The silence around it reinforces the idea that it's something we shouldn't talk about. It's something that might be embarrassing to talk about, might make people uncomfortable to talk about in an academic context. I'm sure everyone who studies reproductive activities has kind of encountered this in their professional life. But the third reason why this matters is that the silences around abortion and geography, they don't only contribute to the kind of stigma around abortion, but they contribute to this idea that it's a very contentious, politicized issue, and that we would only want to think about it as an example of kind of the most morally contested thing we could possibly think about that generates all kind of violence and you know, kind of back and forth battles on the issue. We want to contest that framing of abortion. So the fourth reason why we want to advocate for geographers to take abortion seriously is because we think that as an issue, abortion is really uniquely positioned to give us insight into that relationship between women and pregnant people and the state. It's a unique site to understand the mechanisms of control and resistance that exist around reproductive lives and the whole range of reproductive activities, like Cordelia has mentioned. So I'm just going to give you a sense of how we're going to structure the talk today. And this is, again, so we're writing this paper on the topic, or we've already written it, and this is how we're breaking down the paper. And so we're each going to kind of take our own section and tell you a bit about it. So Fran is going to talk about discourse, I'm going to talk about spatiality, and then Cordy is going to talk about mobility. So I will hand it over to Fran now.
Okay, thanks. By way of introduction to our work and the work that we've been doing on this paper, something that we wanted to tell you all about was how we met. And we met at the ReproSoc conference in Cambridge in June 2018. That was the first time that we sort of knew of each other through mutual acquaintances. But the first time we met in person and had a conversation was at that conference at Murray Edwards, which was a fabulous opportunity for us to talk about our shared interests in abortion access, reproductive justice, protest, resistance. And it's really where the work that we're talking about today was born. So we thought it would be nice to let you know that that was a really fundamental sort of eureka moment for us in our careers. And it has been so lovely to find colleagues who are, you know, with shared interests. So that's where the work came from. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my bit of the work. So I'm a historical geographer. I'm very interested in discourse. Discourse is beloved of geographers. We're interested in the power-knowledge nexus. And a lot of the work that we do in our little trio in what we've started to call Repro-Jog explores systems of knowledge, ways of thinking about bodies. And we explore bodies of knowledge, medical knowledge, legal knowledge, and societal attitudes. So discourse analysis is a really important tool. And also for ways, thinking about ways to decolonize our scholarship as well. In my own work and the work that I've done for this collaborative project, I'm very interested in gendered social norms about sexuality and how pregnant people are supposed to behave. And I like to look at how these norms and ideas work as forms of control and how they transfer through time so that you can see traces of them, a very, what we might think of as very old, say Victorian sexual morality, how you can see traces of that in the present. So I am a theoretician, but I promise I won't say too much about that today. But I do use a lot of Foucauldian techniques to explore the sort of what we like to call the conditions under which it's possible for things to be thought, so concepts and ideas of truth, and that helps us as a group think through the very restrictive or even emancipatory discourses that have very material, very real consequences for reproduction. So something that I've been really interested in most recently is the question of geography as a subject and the kind of epistemic baggage that it has as a masculinist subject rooted in it has a long history of male explorers going out and doing sort of heroic field work. There have been some discussions recently within feminist geography about what kind of knowledge is possible given that kind of intellectual DNA, given that kind of sort of heritage. And so I've been wondering, you know, if geography has been a discipline of the heroic white male explorers, then what can we do intellectually on questions about reproduction, about the body, about that sort of interiority? And as Sydney was saying a moment ago, reproduction and abortion particularly hasn't always been seen as a respectable topic, particularly I think within geography, and we've found this silence that we're very interested in. And as a historical geographer, I wondered whether it stemmed from much earlier in the discipline, where there were sort of forms of geography And Gillian Rose has written extensively about the sort of paternal lineage of geography, and that their particular knowledges were acceptable. So we're exploring at the moment that this kind of silence in geography might have its own story. And also it might relate to a sort of social norm around sexuality as being seen as normatively private, something that my colleague in geography, Phil Howell, has written a lot about. Plus the idea that abortion is a sensitive topic. And there are questions there about, certainly I've been asked questions in my geographical research about privacy and whether these types of issues should be researched, whether it's ethical for researchers to do this kind of research. So I suppose what we've been trying to do is contextualize our interest in abortion within the history of the discipline that is our sort of intellectual home, and ask, you know, how is that lineage contributing, or how is it affecting the work that we do? There's no easy answers to those questions, but I certainly have enjoyed asking them and returning to a lot of that early feminist geography literature to sort of think through this issue. So let me explain a bit about why I like discourse so much. For me, it's about accessing power geometries and trying to uncover assumptions that seem to be very common sense, but actually underpin cultures of regulation. This idea that women should be mothers, that women are caregivers, and that's their social role. And I like to try and trace the history of that, and particularly about norms about how people should behave, anxieties around sexuality that might stem from those very binary forms of gender in the Victorian times, when women were thought to be best placed at home in the private sphere, and their role was to have children for the sort of strength of the race, and that link between their individual behaviour and wider social goals about the population. So that gives us a sort of cue to use abortion of the procedure as a way to think about much larger questions about nationhood, about colonial power, about citizenship, which we've all found really, really interesting. There's a sort of geopolitics. There was a great paper a while back by Catherine McKinnon about the geopolitics of birth. So we've been very interested in those scalar links. So the discursive approach helps me to think through those. A lot of the work that I've done so far has been on the very binary gender culture of the 19th century, as epitomized in this old image here, that 19th and early 20th century gendered social norms were about the categories, very fixed, essentialized categories of male and female, women at home. But importantly, those women at home were fragile. They were seen as sexually passive and in need of oversight, and at the sort of mercy of their reproductive body. So I've been looking at a lot of feminist literature, Anne Oakley's work, or Ornella Moscucci's work on the history of gynecology, thinking about how women needed a sort of constant medical supervision. I've also been interested, as I said, in the sort of geopolitical and colonial dimension to this. And a piece of legislation that the three of us have long been interested in is the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, which prohibits abortion. It arrives in this sort of context. So I think there's a particular framing of a reproductive body as a female body that has a racial duty, but actually needs oversight and supervision. And I've been looking at the ways in which that sort of wanders through time, that it migrates. So some of the work that we've been doing most recently, sorry, I'm just moving my little squares of you all so I can see my slides. Some of the work that we've been doing is to find those discursive overlaps in our own work and through space and time. So my PhD was largely about illegal abortion in the early 20th century. And I looked at lots of different sort of discourses, particularly about the backstreet abortionist. We know at the time maternal mortality remained high, and that illegal self-managed abortion or illegal and self-managed abortion did contribute to this. And I was interested in the representations of abortionists as backstreet butchers who were extortionists, and led women astray. But actually what I found in my own work was that a different place for the abortionist in working class culture in Lancashire, that abortion was an accepted part of working class life in the early 20th century in Lancashire in the UK, and that healthcare practitioners who performed it often provided lots of other services to women across their life course, including herbalism and delivering babies. So I began to see these sort of narratives and counter narratives. And one of the great joys of my collaboration with Cordy and Sydney has been that some of the things that I found in the UK in the early 20th century, they have found in their work in the present day in different parts of the world. So what we've ended up doing is having 3 or 4 different case studies of things that we found out that are very different in space and time, but being able to sit them next to each other and see that they show us very similar things. So one of the best examples, and I've put 2 of them on the slide, is Cordy's work on secret networks of female assistance on the Chile-Peru abortion trail. And she's going to talk about that in a minute, so I'll not do that job for her. But the way that the women that I studied accessed the legal abortion in the 19th century was almost identical. They relied on a network of trusted women to find them a reputable practitioner to access the procedure. So very different in space and time, these case studies, but very, very similar modalities of access. A very similar overlap with Sydney's work, that and this was the joy of our Repro SOC conference, that this is the conversation we had, that Sydney was thinking about the circulation of abortion pills in Ireland before repeal, governmental concern about women accessing unscrupulous providers without that medical oversight. This figure of the fragile woman in need of medical supervision was there again. We first see her in the 19th century, but actually she's right there in the present day as well. So that was just a wonderful conversation on a warm afternoon in June at that conference. So moving on to sort of how these logics migrate through time, I've been quite interested to see this figure of the fragile woman appear in all kinds of unexpected places. And one of the episodes that struck me as very interesting was Britney Spears' legal conservatorship. And in 2021, it was revealed that arrangement prevented her from moving a contraceptive device from her body. And the discourse around that, the sort of reasoning behind the conservatorship, taking an interest in her childbearing patterns, seemed to me to be that she was characterized as a sort of fragile figure who needed that constant supervision or protection, which seemed very much at odds with our feminist, our so-called feminist present. Very similarly, in the March 2020, at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, the UK government prevaricated about whether women should be allowed to take both doses of the abortion pill at home. And so they decided that would be okay, and there was a U-turn and then a reversal. And actually Sydney alerted us to this earlier, that that arrangement is now going to come to an end for very similar reasons, relating to the fact that women seem to, it's felt that women seem to need the guidance of the doctor and the oversight of that medical supervision. So I've been looking for these moments across time where I could find these discourses and see what they told us. And in sort of elsewhere, I've suggested that there is a form of Victorian present where very, very old ideas about women and reproduction and behavior seem to appear as forms of regulation. And there seems to be a reluctance to grant women autonomy in some cases. So I've been looking for some of those little episodes. So what I do in my section of the research is I sort of offer these redescriptions of the present to try to uncover the choices, the priorities, and the alternatives in the regulation the procedure. And instead of just sort of keeping the 19th century in the 19th century and saying, well, you know, those discourses are of their time, I think what I've begun to do is uncover the way in which some of these controlling ideas are reassembled in the present, that they have a sort of, you know, they're reassembled and they reappear in the present to carry on doing some quite important work. And that's a small part of how we understand the cultures of regulation that we're interested in, and sometimes what might stand in the way of processes of criminalization, processes of access to reproductive health care. But I think fundamentally the most exciting thing for me is that it's allowed us to compare case studies that are very, very different in space and time, but to write across those case studies to see the similarities in representations, and that sort of discursive approach and a post-structuralist approach about, you know, being wary of categories and thinking about power has been really, really useful in understanding change through space and time. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and hand over.
Okay, I'm going to share my slides now. Okay, great. So let me just start a little timer. Okay, so I'm gonna, carrying on from what Franz introduced, I'm gonna talk about the spatiality of abortion. I think as geographers of abortion, we often get asked, or we get kind of puzzled looks about talking about abortion geographies. People are often kind of wondering, how is this geographical? And I think abortion travel, you know, across jurisdictions is maybe the first level at which people think about the geography of abortion. But I want to talk today about some different kinds of spatiality that relate to abortion. So let me, there we go. So we could think about the spatiality of abortion at a lot of different scales. You know, geographers, we love scales. The scales at which we could tackle the geography of abortion go everywhere from the womb, you know, David Delaney, Sophie Lewis have been writing about this in a kind of legal geography, human geography context. We could think about the body, we could think about the clinic, the kind of doctor-patient relationship. We can think about the community as a scale where, you know, stigma and social norms operate. And of course, we can think about the state, the country, the region, and so on. But I want to talk specifically about clinic space today. And I want to give two different examples about the way that abortion's spatiality is regulated at the scale of the clinic. One of the examples I want to use to illustrate this point is perhaps, you know, the most extreme restricted example that we could think of. And then another one is a less restricted context. But I want to show that some similar mechanisms operate in ways that help us understand abortion as one of these sites where, you know, lives and gender norms are governed, as Fran has put in this historical context for us. So one of these examples that I want to give is the kind of infamous example of Romania's abortion ban, you know, during the rule of Ceausescu under kind of state socialism. This is a notoriously restrictive context for abortion, kind of, I think, famous as, you know, the most restrictive and violently enforced abortion ban. But the interesting thing from a geographical perspective is really looking into the mechanisms through which this abortion ban was enforced. We can really see the spatial arrangement of abortion at the community level and at the level of the clinic, the doctor-patient interaction, and so on. It was even called a kind of strategy of territorializing abortion. This is how the state named its effort to restrict abortion. So just to kind of introduce this context for people that aren't familiar with it, Romania under state socialism was, you know, like many places, understood kind of population as being labor force, and understood, the size and strength of population as being conducive to either the economic health or poverty of the nation. So when there was a steady fall in the birth rate across the 1950s, by the mid-1960s, the state really started to panic and think, we need to increase the birth rate. The way in which they decided to do this was to implement a total ban on abortion, except abortion was banned except in a few very, very limited circumstances. And the way that this ban was enforced was through these mechanisms that Gail Kligman calls constant procedures of supervision and surveillance. And I'm drawing a lot on Gail Kligman's work here to talk about geographical dimensions of the system that she's identified. So just to give you a few examples of how this operated, we can really see the spatiality of abortion governance in this context because of the different kinds of state and medical institutions that were enrolled in the enforcement of the law there. So to give you a few examples, this system called Territorialization operated across the country. And what that did was, at the regional level, it designated particular hospitals that could provide legal abortion and designated other hospitals that were not allowed to provide abortion. In hospitals that were permitted to provide abortion, doctors in charge of obstetrics and gynecology units were personally responsible for overseeing every abortion or miscarriage that took place in the hospital to make sure that it fell within the bounds of the law. The surgical equipment that was needed to perform an abortion was controlled by a designated member of staff who was charged with monitoring that equipment. And any doctor or nurse who made a request for using that equipment would have to sign it out and be personally liable for whatever procedure was carried out with that equipment. If we think about medication abortion today, I think it's kind of interesting note to see how this kind of mid-20th century law understood abortion as a procedure kind of done to a patient by a doctor with a set of equipment that could be locked up. Obviously, abortion pills have really transformed this in a really exciting way. But nonetheless, the procedures that operated here really show us the way that doctor-patient interactions and the space of hospitals and clinics served as sites of control over abortion. Similarly, there were population level analyses carried out of districts. And in those analyses, what they would do is look for the total population of reproductive age women in order to estimate the number of pregnancies and births that should happen were there to be no abortions. Places that had a discrepancy between the number of births that were predicted and the number of births that occurred were designated zones at risk, and they were subject to even more scrutiny. In those zones at risk where there were fewer births than were predicted based on demographic information, state authorities would carry out investigations of individual doctors based on the assumption that doctors were providing illegal abortions for a fee, and therefore based on the assumption that doctors would be in possession of some sort of wealth that they shouldn't be through their state salaries. So again, this example provides us with maybe the most kind of notoriously extreme mechanism through which an abortion ban is enforced. But I think it helps us to understand some of that spatiality that we're interested in thinking through. And the reason I start with this very extreme example is because I think it has a lot of resonance with debates that feminist abortion activists and scholars are still engaging with today. So again, I think that in a historical context, Fran introduced this a bit, but medical supervision and gatekeeping has been really important to both the criminalization and the legalization of abortion in different contexts. abortion criminalization in places in Europe and North America kind of arose in tandem with the professionalization of medicine, and with this idea that doctors should be able to make decisions over who was deserving of abortion or who qualified for it and who didn't. This kind of medical regime of control and supervision, it's still in force today. I mean, I'm sure people in this call are aware that the 1967 Abortion Act that still operates in parts of the UK maintains abortion as a criminal act. It just carves out some sort of circumstances under which doctors can agree that a person qualifies for an abortion. So for this reason, there's been a lot of feminist ambivalence around the extent to which abortion should be understood and publicly messaged as a healthcare procedure. In some places where laws are extremely restrictive and anti-abortion sentiment is widespread, activists have really sought to demonstrate that abortion is a normal part of reproductive health care, and that it should be normalized and socially accepted and regulated on that basis. But of course, feminists have been quite ambivalent about that, because at the same time, accepting abortion as a medical procedure overseen by a doctor introduces the risk of unnecessary, burdensome regulations, obstructions, and medical gatekeeping. I think there's really no better example of this than the announcement of the government today on the telemedicine abortion regulations in the UK. I don't know if people saw this. I mean, it was a bit confusing because a few weeks ago, the newspapers were reporting, wrongly it turns out, the newspapers were reporting that the government had decided to allow telemedicine abortion indefinitely after COVID. But actually today, the UK government announced that they were going to roll back that restriction in 6 months and stop abortion providers offering pills by post, making people come back into clinics in order to have that consultation with their doctor. So I started with that example of Romania to give you a sense of how this looks in a very restrictive context. I want to now move to talk about the US, where, of course, we know abortion is hotly contested, and even though it's sort of, for the moment, enshrined in constitutional law, at the state level it varies greatly. And again, in the US, we can really see the way that abortion spatiality within that clinic site is a place where access is contested, resisted, and in a lot of cases obstructed. So I have a reference here to Paltrow and Flavin's work, which is extremely important work on the criminalization of pregnancy and pregnancy-related crimes in the US. Just to give you a sense of how this kind of territorialization process operates in a country where abortion is ostensibly legal, Paltrow and Flavin show that across the entirety of the US, almost a quarter of the arrests for pregnancy-related crimes take place in 1 out of the 50 states. And of those arrests that take place in that state, which is South Carolina, almost 30% come from a single hospital. So the geography of criminalization here, it makes a huge difference, right? Where you live, who you are, and it's no surprise that the people criminalized for pregnancy-related crimes tend to be the most marginalized in class and race terms. So I want to finish up by giving you one other illustration of the way that spatiality operates when it comes to abortion. And this is an example where I want to think through medication abortion. Cordelia is going to talk a bit in a second about how spatial strategies for, traveling abroad, importing pills, kind of resisting abortion laws with movement mobility, how those can be resources for pro-choice, pro-abortion advocates. But it's important for us to recognize that the spatiality of abortion is also a resource that anti-abortion activists today are really, really actively using. And medication abortion restrictions present us with an interesting example of this. So I've recently published a paper in Transactions that makes this argument in a lot more detail, but I just want to summarize it now. When we're looking at the doctor-patient relationship and the kind of spatiality of abortion in the clinic in the US today, what's really important for us to understand is that there's a whole spate of laws and regulations that are attempting to embed medication abortion within the bounds of the abortion clinic. So those are laws that prohibit telemedicine abortion. Those are laws that require multiple visits to a clinic. And those are laws that require the physical presence of doctor and patient in the same room. Franz pointed out that this has a lot of interesting resonances with medical cultures of laying hands on the patient. There's a lot of medication abortion restrictions today that deliberately enforce a kind of physical proximity between doctor and patient. And they do this in order to make medication abortion more burdensome to access, to make sure that people have to make multiple trips to a clinic, to make sure that it's more expensive, it takes longer to access, and so on. So a lot of the medication abortion laws that we see in the US today are interested in regulating this doctor-patient interaction and sort of enforcing a proximity between those actors. But they do this at the same time that they're trying to eliminate access to abortion altogether by closing clinics. So it's a kind of two-pronged strategy. And as with so many abortion restrictions we see today, and as with the telemedicine restriction that we saw today from the UK government, they're put forward in the name of women's health and well-being. So I'm just going to conclude with these two examples to give you a sense of how abortion spatiality is being contested and being used as a resource for greater restriction of abortion today. These are both examples from the US, and these are snippets from pieces of legislation. You can see that in both cases, and these are two examples from dozens of similar bills, what they do is they say, and of course they use gendered language here, so they always talk about women, sometimes they talk about mothers in the bills themselves. And what they always say is that the woman has to be physically present in the same room with the physician when the drug is given. So what these do is effectively prohibit telemedicine abortion. They say you have to be physically present in the clinic room, have to be physically examined by the doctor in order to obtain the medication. Sometimes they say things like the doctor who does the physical examination has to be the one who dispenses the medication. So again, we can see here how spatial strategies are being used to restrict abortion. Similarly, a lot of legislation in the US on telemedicine provides for access to telemedicine and telehealth for numerous procedures, but with explicit carve-outs for abortion. So it says telehealth and telemedicine can be used to prescribe any drug except mifepristone and misoprostol. So in my section of the paper, I try to give a sense of how abortion is spatial and the multiple levels of spatiality at which it operates. So right now, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Cordelia for the third section on mobility.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Fran and Sydney. As they have both shown, abortion is an issue about discourse and it's an issue about spatiality. What I'm now going to talk about how it's also an issue of mobility and immobility. So I want to begin just by kind of zooming out and trying to situate this within the broader literature on reproductive mobilities. So there are strands or examples of literature that think about that relationship between reproduction and mobility that, you know, have been, we can see examples of this in the last couple of decades. But what I think was an important intervention was a 2020 special section of the journal Mobilities. And I think what was special about this is while there had been work about mobility and reproduction, it happened with people who study reproduction. So IVF, surrogacy, these kind of things. What this special section did was bring it really centrally into mobilities scholarship. And I think the special section came out of a workshop in Canada on reproductive mobilities. And what the authors try to do is to show that mobilities scholarship has really ignored reproduction. It's also definitely had issues of gender as well, but reproduction very, very clearly. And this is a real shame, because there are real points of connection where, as Mimi Scheller says in this first quote, that mobilities theory and ideas about reproduction can really help us understand the other one in more depth. And other authors in a different paper in the special section talk about all the different forms of mobilities that really inform and shape reproductive practices and really help us understand reproduction in more depth. So this is why it's been so important, and I think this has been a useful moment in really pushing forward the theoretical ideas about reproductive mobilities. However, I would say, just as Fran said earlier about how geography has thought about procreative reproductive mobilities, it's thought about things like IVF and surrogacy, it hasn't thought about abortion, and there has continued to be a shyness and I think perhaps like a squeamishness around abortion within mobility scholarship as well as geography. And I think this is a real shame, because I think there's a lot of interesting things to say about abortion mobilities, particularly when we think about the power and the politics. We know that abortions involve mobility in some way. When people travel, we know there's a power and there's a politics to who gets to travel and what their travel looks like. So very kind of well-known, famous examples of this are, for example, this map, the abortion deserts in the USA. Thinking about, well, who gets to move and what does that travel look like when people are forced to travel for abortions to clinics that are left open. And Beverly Skeggs, thinking about mobility more broadly, not about abortion mobilities, has argued that mobility and control over mobility both reflect and reinforce power. Mobility is a resource to which not everyone has an equal relationship. And this is incredibly clear when we look at abortion, when we see about how barriers to abortion particularly affect young people, young women, Indigenous women and women of colour, rural women, women on low incomes, and trans and queer communities who struggle to access abortions. And this is why a reproductive justice perspective is so important when we're thinking about abortion mobilities. So in a paper I wrote a couple of years ago, I tried to have write a bit of a definition of what I thought abortion mobilities were. I'd say it's a bit basic, and I think maybe I'm going to have another crack at it in a different paper, but it's useful, I think, enough for now, and to kind of shape what I'm going to be speaking about for the rest of this talk. I define abortion mobilities there as the movement and fixity of people and things that shape abortion access. And what I want to do is, I don't want to be too theoretical for the rest of this. Instead, I want to get empirical and talk about two case studies that I draw out of this definition. First of all, I want to talk about how I've studied pregnant people traveling from Chile to Peru for abortions. So that movement of people, but then also the movement of things. And that thing that I look at is the abortion pill, misoprostol, and strategies for moving that in Latin America. So let's get into those case studies. So this first one, abortion at border crossings from Chile to Peru. The paper came out a few years ago with a little reference at the bottom. And this research emerged when I was a PhD student in 2013, and I was based in the border city of Arica, which is right in northern Chile, just 16 kilometers south of the border with Peru. And I wasn't studying abortion at all. I never thought I would study abortion in my PhD, but my PhD was about border politics and violence on the border. And I heard from someone there that women were traveling from northern Chile to southern Peru for abortions. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting. I don't really know why that would be happening, because looking at the laws, at that time, abortion was illegal in every single circumstance in Chile and pretty much every single circumstance in Peru. You could apply for a therapeutic abortion, but the chances of getting it are very, very slim. So pretty much all abortions are criminalized. And so I think this is when I first became illusioned with a purely legal perspective, because the law didn't explain why people would travel, because it's pretty much the same level of illegality in both countries. Why would you bother traveling? Began to do some searching. There hadn't been anything on it. The only time I found anything about this was in local newspaper reports when women had been caught in their travels to Peru for abortions. And this is obviously humiliating punishment in the local news. anonymous, but not really anonymous. So this became part of my research, and I was doing interviews with people, and basically what I found was that they're very different abortion landscapes in these two countries. Chile is incredibly hostile as an abortion landscape, particularly because of a Pinochet government, which before Pinochet had to give up power in the late 80s, he made abortion a crime in every single circumstance. It's now been lifted in three causes in 2017. Whereas, so what that meant in Chile was that it's incredibly controlled. It's very hard to buy abortion pills, for example, and clinics, it's very hard to find clinics unless you are wealthy. So wealthy women, particularly in metropolitan areas, are able to pay their doctors, or they're able to leave abroad. Whereas Peru had a different culture. There it's easier to buy pills. There are more clinics, as I'll speak about in a minute. And so what I was finding with people I was speaking to, people wanting to travel, not because it was legal where they were traveling to, but because it was cheaper. It was more accessible. They're able to find places for abortions because of this different culture, and it was more anonymous. And for context, this is a very crossed border. So on this map, on the one on the right, the red line is the border between Chile and Peru, and the cities of Arica and Tacna are only 58 kilometers apart. It takes just over an hour, many buses. So this border is traveled very regularly. People go for shopping, to eat, to party, to get glasses, to go to a doctor. And so traveling for abortions is kind of within this hyper border crossing context. And what are they crossing for? They're often crossing to go to clinics like this photo. So this is just one, this is an OB-GYN clinic that I found. And you can see the second bullet point on their list means late period. So this is a code word that is used that people know. This is somewhere where you can inquire about a clandestine abortion. And some of these are run by brilliant medical professionals who can offer very safe abortions. However, not all of them are. And it's very difficult to know in the context of illegality which is which, because you can't say, can I see your medical certificate, for example. And these are the kind of things that people spoke about in interviews. There's a real sense of fear around these abortions that people are traveling for. People saying, I know it's a risk, that the standards of hygiene there aren't the best, or so I've been told, that they're scary places, but it's not very well known. And people are dying to have an abortion in Tacna. It's not in the media, it's not really spoken about, but everyone knows that people go to Tacna to do it. So it's kind of an open secret, which has been a term that Natalie Kimball have used in their work on abortion in Bolivia. This sense that people know it's happening frequently, but there's still this fear about it. And someone who I spoke to who had traveled for their own abortion to Tacna said, obviously I was scared for my life. Oh, it was awful. Yeah, I was terrified. It's like, these are things that aren't legal, you know. Anything illegal is going to scare you because it's not safe. You can't go to someone if it goes wrong. You don't have that right. There is no right to an abortion. And they certainly didn't have a right to travel to Peru either. So in this paper, I'm particularly thinking about a biopolitical perspective, in that the governance of abortion works so that even if you're caught coming back, which people are, because you have to cross a border checkpoint, or if there are complications, they go to hospital and it comes out that way. They're still punished by the Chilean state. So what mainly came up in this work was people traveling for surgical abortions in clinics, but I was also hearing about people going across the border to buy the abortion pill misoprostol, which is more easily available in Peru, which is nicknamed the paradise of misoprostol. So this led to what became my next project, which I'm working on at the moment, where I'm thinking about abortion mobilities in Latin America. And at the moment, I'm particularly working in Peru and Mexico to think about, well, what happens when it's pills that are doing the moving instead of people? So while my earlier work was thinking about the movement of people, we're now thinking about the mobility of things. So misoprostol, just in case anyone isn't aware, it was designed in 1973 by the pharmaceutical company Searle, and it was designed as a stomach ulcer drug. However, it had some side effects, and that meant on the packet, it has a little cartoon, very pregnant woman with a red line through it, and it says, don't use if you're pregnant because it's going to cause miscarriages. So in the context of illegality in Brazil, women were looking for various techniques to end their pregnancy. And so they experimented it and over time developed a safe and effective abortion regimen using misoprostol alone. Ideally, it's used in combination with mifepristone. It's often called the gold standard, but that's much harder to find because it's an abortion pill. So where abortion is illegal, it's hard to find. Whereas misoprostol, it's got what's been termed this double life by Silvia de Zordo, because it is technically a stomach ulcer drug. So you can sell it, you can use it, just not for an abortion. And clinical trials have shown it's effective up to 93% of cases. So it is highly effective. And what I've been thinking about in my work on abortion pills is what happens when the pills are doing the moving instead of people. And these abortion journeys, as I kind of showed through the Peru-Chile example, they can be incredibly terrifying. They can involve having to go through the abortion while traveling on the bus, for example, being in pain while having to travel, the fear of going to somewhere you've never been to. So in Mexico, for example, this has come up because abortion is legal in Mexico City, but not in most other states. So if you're living in a state really far from Mexico City and you go there for the first time, it can be a very overwhelming experience. So there can be a lot of negative emotions and experiences involved in abortion travel, and abortion pills, for some at least, can help deal with some of those, but there's many cases where they're not fully emancipatory. So I think, as I said in this paper, they're emancipatory with a caveat. So I've been working with my colleague Sandra Rodriguez, and we've been thinking about talking to groups, talking to abortion providers, abortion activists, NGOs, about how they make these pills move. How do we deal with this issue of preventing people from having to do the traveling? So there's loads of different strategies, and they've been really, really interesting to hear about, really. So some activists are able to create relationships with people who make and sell pills and able to get them through them. Some bring the pills into the country by themselves. So on their person, they might travel specifically for this, or kind of do it with other trips that they need to do. Or they might have relationships with NGOs who send the pills, for example, from clinics in India. Some will go to pharmacies directly and buy the pills. And this might be because most clinics in Peru and Mexico will need a prescription. But if you've got someone who's able to write your prescription, or you're able to get a prescription in a creative way, that's very useful. There's one group we've spoken to who have been using the same prescription for 2 years. So as long as you don't let the pharmacist have it, you can keep on using it. It's often kind of a bit of a performance. It's a theatre. They need to say, yes, I have seen a prescription. We've been speaking to people about how they move the pill, and with particular this rural urban issue of how do you get it to places where the postal system isn't very good. So someone explained how they would give the pills to a bus driver who would pass them on when they got there. And just a few days ago, actually, I did an interview with someone who said when they do use the postal system, you can't, if you live with family, for example, if you get a package in the post, your family can say, oh, what's that? What have you got in the mail? You know, that's exciting. It's, you know, oh, what have you got? And so what she would do is put the pills in something. So in clothing, in a teddy bear, in a trinket, so that the person receiving the pills could say, oh, look, I've got this t-shirt. When actually hidden in there would be the pills that they could then use. And one that I loved from a very geographical perspective was these groups who are making heat maps. So they're drawing up these maps of towns, of cities, and marking on where different pharmacies are, how much misoprostol costs at those pharmacies, whether you need prescriptions or not, and then sharing these with people so they're able to go and buy the pills themselves. So these are kind of just some of the range of strategies that we've been hearing about in Mexico and Peru, and I think are really ingenious and are really crucial ways of making this pill move to prevent people having to travel for abortions. So just to finish up, what we argue in this paper that we're writing together, the Reproductive trio, is that we really need to think and take mobility seriously when we're thinking about abortion, because there's always something on the move. It might be people, it might be pills. One thing I didn't get to speak about today is knowledge, but the way in which information and strategies move also really important, and that abortion mobilities encompass barriers to movement, the privilege of not moving, and technologies that facilitate immobility. So thank you very much to everyone for listening. I hope that wasn't too much geography for everyone in the room. But yeah, I guess it's over for questions.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. That was super stimulating, and I have a bunch of questions myself. But before I indulge, I will hand over to the audience. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to pop it in the chat or raise your hand, and we will invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question to the speakers. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrong, but Ikra?
Hi, hello. If you can hear me, I just wanted to say I found that really interesting. So my question is about social media. So I'm 18, so I think a lot of the discourse that I've heard around abortion so far, I've been exposed to through social media instead of like traditional means like education. So I just wanted to ask, what do you think is the direction of the research in terms of looking at social media and discourses on social media?
I'll take that one. Thank you very much. It's a good question. I think, to be honest, that I haven't actually seen any research at this point on that topic. But I think what I can say is that social media as a way to move around information and controlling images is something that I think all of us share a huge interest in, because it perpetuates, forms of knowledge. It can be emancipatory, but it can also be incredibly restrictive. And so I think it really, looking at social media as a sort of topic really fits with our repro-jog approach in terms of thinking about how we understand the topic of abortion, how we understand what a reproductive body is, and the forms of knowledge that come to regulate those bodies, and but also crucially forms of resistance as well. I think all of us are quite interested in countercultures and sort of countervailing forces, and I wonder whether that social media might help us uncover those as well.
Can I add something to that, Fran? I think that it's a super interesting question, and I think that as far as the sort of research goes, I think I agree with Fran. This is something that's not been that researched in the kind of geography space, but I do know from following the work of activist groups that groups that try to facilitate access to abortion pills, for instance, have found social media kind of a tricky terrain sometimes, because ultimately all the platforms that we use are owned by companies with their own sort of abortion politics, right? So there have been a lot of instances where groups have been like kicked off a certain platform, banned from the App Store, and so on. So in a lot of contexts, I think abortion pill activists try to use like lower tech methods, right? Like for instance, all over the place, we see, phone numbers written on walls in graffiti. We see stickers with websites you can go to, because sometimes those social media platforms aren't really that reliable if the company who owns it decides that they don't want abortion activism on there. So I think you're right that there's a huge opportunity there, but there are some big limitations that I think activists face in getting their message out through social media.
Yeah, just to, I guess, finish with that. Yes, completely what Sydney just said. I was doing an interview with someone last night in Peru, and I was asking about how they were using Facebook in their abortion activism. And they were saying actually like social media wasn't being that useful for them. They had a hotline where people could call for abortion information, and they were finding it much more useful to use the low-tech strategies that Sydney was just saying. So printing stickers, and putting them in universities, in public loos and public spaces, because being able to find those more static ways of keeping the same information, so search for this or call this number. So a lot of it's still around phone numbers, because data can be really, really expensive in many parts of the world, and free Wi-Fi can be really hard to find. So phone numbers. So yeah, I've been surprised in my work, exactly what Sydney just said, that a lot of it is more low tech. And there's sometimes this ambivalence with social media, because it can be really useful and it can create these connections transnationally, but it can also come with a lot of these problems of governance and control. But it's, yeah, such an interesting topic. So thank you for your question.
I'll go to Rachel.
Hi, thank you very much for this. I have a more of a comment from Catherine Bryan. She's a fourth year PhD student at MMLL at Cambridge. I have another connection for Frankie from a different cultural context. My PhD research on abortion depictions in French novels from the first decade of the 20th century. A majority of the legal abortionists that by this point were therapeutic abortions to save the life of the mother were practiced by a doctor, were usually midwives who had been forced out of assisting childbirth by increasing restrictions and requirements of a medical doctor. They were known as angel makers, but were portrayed in the press as witch-like figures, and my novels have a recurrence of bird imagery to describe this woman's hooked noses and claw-like fingers.
I mean, that's hugely interesting. There is some work on the sort of representations of abortionists in literature in Britain, which is really fascinating. And I think, you know, historians have done a lot of work on that. So yeah, that is super interesting.
Phoebe Martin, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I couldn't work out how to unmute myself. Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been super interesting. Actually, the question I had kind of came out of the last question, because I was thinking about, you know, you were talking about this of the spatiality of all the stickers on the street, but in my research was also about Peru. What I found from activists is a lot of them said that it was hard to know with the stickers on the street whether they were friendly services or dangerous ones, because I know that a lot of activists do use the streets, but also if you look on the streets, some of them are, you know, much more predatory services. And I wondered how you kind of negotiate that, or what you thought about that idea of, like, it's like a weird thing where like it's so heavily present, like you walk down the street and like every lamppost has a sticker on it saying like menstrual delay, but also you don't know which one will be, you know, the sort of like the lack of knowing and the sort of pervasive spatiality of it. And it just kind of reminded me of that sort of weird feeling of it. And I wondered, and that kind of reminded me with the last question.
Yeah, that's it's such a big problem across Latin America. And in interviews I've been doing, like, it's the way in which people are able to clone websites and use the language as well. So they're able to kind of just, they make it look like a completely legit site where you can buy pills or get information about abortions, and it's impressive that they're able to do it so well. But you know, I might be able to see some language kind of looks a bit funny, because I think about this literally every day of my life. But if you've got an unwanted pregnancy and it's your first time on one of these websites, why on earth would you know that that one isn't real, or that that sticker on the street is actually a lie? So yeah, but the real issue of the numbers or the adverts or the websites that are claiming to sell misoprostol or combi packs, they often say that you'll get mifepristone as well. They'll send things which are out of date, which are adulterated, so flour, sugar. They give you pills that they can cause bleeding but won't actually provoke an abortion, so you might think that you've got something effective. And this is all really just pernicious, because what it means is that you then might be out of the window in which you can have a safe abortion with pills, for example. So it's a money-making racket, but it's so hard. Like, just as you said, it's really hard to know. So I guess all I found in my research so far is the frustration of this. And I don't know, I don't know what there is to do much about it. Organizations like Women on Web and Women Help Women do act as these more reputable figures, I guess, who are able to signpost local organizations who are going to be good and legit. But getting people to know about these are really hard. So yeah, I'm not sure much of that is an answer, apart from its frustration with exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's definitely what I found. I guess it's also like personal networks of, if you know someone who knows someone, then you're fine. But that if you're outside of those networks, then you're not going to get the same level of support.
Yeah, or if you have a family and friends, your network aren't people that you can talk to about it, and you don't know where to find that information. You don't even know the words to begin searching for it. It's yeah, real challenges.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got a question from Rebecca Smith in the chat, so I'm just going to read it out. Rebecca says, thank you so much for an interesting discussion. Really looking forward to reading the article and book. I was wondering if you have any reflections on hidden geographies, the fact that certain countries or locations attract so much more attention than others. For example, Ireland, Poland, the US, Argentina get so much more attention than, for example, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Malta. Is there anything that a feminist geography approach could bring to exploring these dynamics?
I can take the first crack at that one, because the book that I'm writing actually very much embodies this critique, because it focuses on Ireland, Poland, and the US. I think it's a really important point, and I've been trying to think about why this is. I think the language divide in academic writing is a huge obstacle. There's been loads of work on abortion activism in Latin America, but I think a lot of it's in Spanish and doesn't get kind of picked up in the Anglophone conversations as much. But I also think it has to do with the kind of prevalence of American and British scholars and Irish scholars in writing about this, which is why those countries are so extensively written about. I actually think Poland isn't quite that researched in an abortion activism sense, although it's a very restrictive context. But it's a great question, and I would say I think the language barrier has been the most important obstacle there. As to what a feminist geography can say about that, that's a great question, and I don't know that I have a great answer off the top of my head. So I'll either let one of my co-authors answer that or just think about it more later.
It's a great question, but yeah, the feminist geography bit is yeah, I feel like we should have a better answer to this as feminist geographers. I would say, Rebecca, your work, you know, you're focusing on one of the less attended countries, I guess. But yeah, Fran, do you have a feminist geography approach?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this. I think if we think about what is feminist geography, what does it try and do? And I think at the heart of it, it's about recuperating the voices and experiences of you know, in our work, reproductive bodies. And I think what this topic has come up against in geography is this silence that we talked about earlier. And so I think Sydney's right that the language barrier has been a problem. And so, but I also think people have looked at contexts which have been dynamic and interesting, where things have been changing rapidly. I mean, I think I don't want to speak for you, Sydney, but I found that in the After Repeal book, that it was you know, it was current, it was unfolding. I taught that book on my third year paper, and it was recent, and we enjoyed thinking about it because it was current. And so I think there's an element of that sort of politics in that, doing something that is relevant to now and is happening now. And certainly that was a source of great excitement, you know, on our third year course, and thinking about Ireland and the subsequent conversations about Northern Ireland and things. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think feminist geography has always been a very shadowy presence in the discipline. It's always sort of the phraseology is, or so the phrase goes, that it's rarely traveled under its own name. So it's still undergoing this sort of question about what it is. And I think that's been something that we have, as a trio, really thought about. What is our work about? What are the big intellectual questions that drive our work? and that's actually, I think, how we came around to these three ideas about, I'm just totally speaking for you all now, but discourse, spatiality, and mobility were three really big themes that we felt were ways in which we could recuperate the experiences of women. We could represent their voices, and not just women, moving beyond that very binary, that very essentialized, category of gender.
I guess the one thing I want to add is that I think the feminist geography lens, of course, it gives us an interest in the transnational and helps us think across context. But I think the other thing that it reminds us is that we're rooted in particular places, and our scholarship is always rooted in our particular positions. So I guess that being American, for instance, and having grown up in the context of kind of the like ever-present polarization of abortion in the US really, really shaped my interest in the topic. And fundamentally shaped the kind of like abortion geography that I first started to look at. But as the discussion about this shows, the fact that the field is dominated by Anglophone countries and white scholars is a huge problem for the field. And Jen Begelman and colleagues recently wrote about this in Reproductive Geographies more broadly, saying it's a very, very white field, and we need to interrogate why that is.
Thanks all. We have another question in the chat, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing the name again, from Ainhoa Rodriguez, who says, thank you so much to the organizers and researchers for sharing your findings. My question is for Cordelia, but could resonate with Sydney and Frankie's research. Cordelia's research has looked at Foucault's concept of biopower and its application to the topic of abortion. The idea that biopower and discipline are related and that are meant to determine what it is and it is not acceptable. My question is about to what extent do you believe that this discipline is ingrained in institutions beyond legal institutions, i.e. schools, hospitals, and how we women might be vulnerable to it from a very early age?
Fantastic. Yeah, I guess I'll start with that one. Yeah, I think in a lot of research about reproductive governance and abortion, we often kind of go to those very obvious sites. And the hospital, the clinic have been these very clear sites. I was sent this incredible photo actually recently of a banner in a Peruvian hospital from 2017, like a poster that said, anyone coming in with complications from a miscarriage has to report to the police. And it got taken down because of outrage. But that kind of a governance that is affecting everyone, and we've seen this really strongly in Central America, that everyone gets affected by this biopower, this control, this reproductive governance over people's bodies. So we often go to these places like hospitals because it's so apparent, it's so clear how this discipline works. But it's absolutely in other spaces. The one that I've seen, I guess, most clearly in my work is the media, and seeing what happens when people get caught having clandestine abortions. So what I was seeing in the press in Chile is that it gets in the news and they might say a 42-year-old teacher from this part of the city, and that isn't really anonymous. But what this does is it serves to create this societal sense of this is a criminal act, and these newspaper articles will usually end with a quote from the criminal code, that the penal code that says an abortion is illegal and this is its sentence. So it's absolutely ingrained in other forms of society, such as the media. And I think that all reinforces that stigma, and it all creates that context of I can't talk about it, I don't have a right to do this. That there's always that ever-present reminder that this is something that women and pregnant people shouldn't get any say over their reproductive lives. But I know that, Fran, especially, you have things to say about biopower and discourse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the way that you use it in the GPC paper is brilliant, because what biopower is, it's the politics of life itself, and so but what particularly it does, and why it's useful for geographers, and in your paper, it seemed to me that it was that scalar link between you regulate the conduct of the individual to get an outcome at the level of the whole. And that's how we end up with this question of how individuals can be targeted by particular disciplinary discourses. I really like the work of Penelope Deutscher here, who talks about reproductive bodies being on the threshold of individual and total. So they're very vulnerable to state intervention, because it isn't just about the control of an individual pregnancy, it's about a population level outcome to do with either the strength of the population or a racial issue, or, like, you know, Cordy, you've written a lot, haven't you, about Chile and the machismo sort of context of that population. And so biopower is so useful here, because we see that targeting of individual bodies to get an outcome, both at the individual but at the level of the total. And one of the best examples of this I've seen is there's a paper in the AAG journal about seafood choices. So the dietary recommendations for pregnant bodies, that because of the level of toxins in seafood, pregnant people shouldn't consume more than a certain level of seafood each week. And the sort of biopolitical discourse around that regulation, that it's intervention. And again, it's very scalar intervention, in that, you know, those individual lives gets that outcome at the level of the total. And so we see it, I think, in the most mundane places, like dietary advice, and that's classically Foucauldian, that it isn't just disciplined through these disciplinary institutions like schools and hospitals and prisons, that that form of regulation is done through society in increasingly, you know, subtle ways.
Thank you, Frankie. While we wait for a couple more questions to come in, I might cheekily pose my own question at this point. So I just wanted to pick up on what you all kind of collectively mentioned at the start about, you know, abortion as a respectable or disrespectable topic of inquiry, and also to pick up on what Frankie spoke about in relation to discourses around abortion and abortion provision, and this idea of the kind of sinister figure of the backstreet abortionist. And I wanted to ask all of you, I suppose, around kind of the discursive positioning of medical abortion versus surgical abortion in relation to that whole idea of respectability, or, you know, acceptableness even. Obviously, as you mentioned, Cordelia, you know, medication abortion has been hugely revolutionary and emancipatory in so many ways for activists across different contexts. But there seems to be, and this is kind of just my own assertion, there seems to be a kind of a positioning of medication abortion in popular media and discourses as being somehow more respectable or acceptable or tolerable as a method of abortion. I'm just wondering if any of you had any comments around that, or had thought about that, or could see any kind of any specific area or kind of questions that we might need to kind of hone in on in relation to that.
Yeah, I'll begin with a very quick point. Is I also study representation, things like abortion on TV, abortion in film, and I've been amazed that self-managed abortion and abortion with pills is almost absent in the media, in popular culture. So I guess it's this. I guess that question of respectability is interesting, because in kind of fiction, it's not there. And I think this is partly like a narrative trope, that like it performs a really useful plot function to see someone having a surgical abortion. So yeah, I think it's more there kind of in the media. But also like I guess the speed in which medication abortion has taken off. So as I kind of mentioned, this all kind of began really in Brazil and favelas, where people were transforming misoprostol into an abortion pill, and that kind of fed back into the global north, and now it's the legitimate first trimester pregnancy. And I got an email from the Maca newsletter thing today saying that medication abortion is now over 50% of abortions in the US. So it's become this incredibly it's taken off, I guess, in these ways. So that's just part of an answer, but I want to leave something for the other two.
I think that this goes to, it's a really good question. It's something I see so much and have like personally experienced in talking about research. But I think this might be an example of how the kind of like feminist, scholarly, and activist conversation is kind of in one place and the kind of public perception is in another place. So I think among like activists and scholars in this area, the endorsement of self-managed abortion as like a sort of emancipatory good thing, that's pretty much set, right? Like demedicalization is a key goal of so many different organizations. But in the sort of popular like public pro-choice movement, I think there's still a move towards like medicalization as a form of kind of respectability. Like I had an experience of giving a job talk somewhere. This job talk went very badly, and somebody in the audience got very upset with me because I was talking about women on web in quite a positive way, and they were basically saying like, well, what you're endorsing is like so dangerous. Why aren't you like more critical of this organization? Because for them, I guess they thought I was endorsing the sort of backstreet butcher. Of course I wasn't, but the distinction there, as Cordy says, I don't think that medication abortion is very well understood in a kind of public context. And so there's still a whole politics of respectability around the kind of good surgical in-clinic abortion versus the dangerous self-managed abortion.
Yeah, if I might just add to that in my own historical work, there's a really interesting sort of persistence of traditional cultures of herbal abortion in the early 20th century, which arrives in the era of, we see the increasing power and reach of biomedicine, but also the continuation of reliance on herbal remedies, so that the abortionists that I researched use herbs like pennyroyal to induce a sort of low-grade poisoning. And what I sort of concluded there was that there was a sort of continuing reliance on women or female-centered, and remember, of course, these notions of gender are very binary at that time, but female-focused or female-centered alternative forms of healing that are herbal cultures, which resist the increasing power and reach of biomedicine at that time. So they persist into the sort of 20s and 30s in the UK, and really are they sit very much at odds with a hospital-based care for pregnancy. So that I found that very interesting as a sort of form of control, but also it's very easy to think of biomedicine as this thing that just sweeps in the 20th century, that the doctor will see. But it for the ladies, for the reproductive bodies that I've been researching, it wasn't always the case, which is very interesting.
Thanks, Al. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to give the last question to Julieta, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Thanks, Aideen. I just wanted to start by thanking the three of you. Such a thought-provoking presentation. And I'm actually very glad to hear your presentation, especially bring in this geographic perspective on abortion, thinking specifically about Latin America and what happened recently with Colombia's, decision to legalize abortion up to the 24th week, which is really unprecedented for the country. And all the discussion that this is creating, like people are going to wait until the 23rd week to get an abortion. So all these panics around, oh, you're going to be aborting, killing humans, and all these interesting debates. But it also makes me think about another way of thinking about it in a spatial mobility perspective, geographic perspective as well, is this idea of the marea verde or the green tide really moving across different contexts, different countries in the region, and really making inroads for legalizing and really advancing feminist agendas around abortion politics. And also, thinking in a way, thinking in parallel to Cordelia with the pill, also what the role that the handkerchief does, in this mobility, in this marea verde. I think it's an interesting perspective to think. So I'm really glad that you brought this up for us today. And I have just a question, a short one. So at the beginning of your presentation, you talk about this idea of decolonizing reproductive studies, and this has come up a little bit in the conversation. I think, Sydney, you mentioned that, this field tends to be very white, particularly centered in some geographic areas. So how do you think about the work of decolonizing this scholarship? How do you think that this work can be done? Thank you.
Should I quickly answer the Latin America bit? I've been asking a lot of people in interviews about whether they kind of feel like it's a domino effect and everything's kind of everything's going to be legalized at some point in Latin America. We're kind of on that road to progress, and pretty much everyone is very skeptical of it, because I think that's partly because of who I talk to, and I talk to people who about providing abortions, self-managed abortions beyond the state, and that law doesn't mean access. And so I was speaking to someone in Colombia about it, and they said, oh no, this organization is still going to exist. It's even the legal up to 24 weeks. Not everyone wants to have an abortion clinic. Not everyone can. People don't trust doctors. So I think I guess I've been surprised about the level of pushback against this idea of the Mare Verde being this amazing emancipatory thing for everyone, because we kind of know of abortion access that it isn't. Of course, it's still great. As one activist group says, the law is the floor, not the ceiling. So people not getting criminalized is fantastic, but it doesn't mean that abortion access is suddenly going to be there for everyone exactly when they need it.
And if we think just, I was just going to say very quickly about the colonizing, decolonizing agenda. It's something that we obviously feel is very important. In my own work, I've been hugely interested in the relationship, as I've explained, between the past and the present. I've been reading a lot of Anne-Laura Stoller's work about imperial toxicities and how they reassemble and deposit in the present. And I think those forms of gender culture that I spoke about with the 19th century angel of the house need to be read as with the coloniality to them, and we need to trace their sort of mobility and travel into the present, and that's something I've been doing in my own work.
I wanted to add on the second question about decolonizing. It's a really something we certainly think about a lot, and I think personally the way I would most like to see the field sort of decolonize would be to decenter the importance of the US in our conversations. I feel like so much of the scholarship is so US centric. I think to some extent, even the way that the reproductive justice framework gets applied in different places, we're often looking to the US as the kind of reference point in ways that I don't often think are the most productive for thinking about non-US contexts. Even just your example about how Latin America is moving towards decriminalization, that's a really exciting trend. And if we were to look to American scholarship about Roe versus Wade, we would have really very little to say about what's happening in Latin America right now. So our constant looking to American scholarship can hold us back sometimes, I think. But the second part of this, I think, also speaks to the Latin American point about the way knowledge travels. I've been super interested in the way that abortion pill activism in Latin America has focused on the idea of social decriminalization preceding legal decriminalization. And I think that's actually something that European feminists have learned from Latin American feminists. So I think one way we can decolonize this field or work towards decolonizing it is to try to think about the way that knowledge is traveling from south to north, and the way that feminists in Latin America haven't been so obsessed with constitutional law like American feminists have been, and have actually been trying to think about transgression, creating sort of change on the ground before trying to focus on legal change and sort of reform through legislation and litigation.
And adding to what you just said, I think it's really interesting because, abortion and hotlines, this has been used in Peru for 10 years or more. So this idea of telemedicine, that it's becoming a big thing, especially with the pandemic and stuff like that. I mean, I have friends in Peru who run the Línea de Aborto Seguro, and they've been doing this for years already. They have manuals, they have all sorts of mechanisms in place for providing information, helping people to find someone that can accompany them in the process. So I think you're absolutely right. It's important to look to a different place as a reference point. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, everybody. We're going to have to wrap it up because we're a couple of minutes over time. So thank you so much to our presenters today, Sydney, Cordelia and Francesca. We really appreciate your being here, and it was fantastic to be able to hear your work. We're very excited to see this paper, and we'll be gleefully sharing it on all of our social media platforms when it comes out. Thank you again to the audience for your very stimulating questions, and we hope to see some of you next week at our event with Professor Dana Ann Davis. Thanks, everybody.